Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we bring Precon decks up to cut rate standards without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazzet, and today we'll be tackling my personal favorite Final Fantasy entry and least favorite Final Fantasy Precon, that being the Final Fantasy X Counter Blitz Precon, helmed by the Blitzball player turned Guardian, Tidus, Yuna's Guardian, to which we'll be adding $30 worth of upgrades to give it a budget but considerable power-up. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content, and if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks for any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Now, with all that chilling out of the way, let's kick off this upgrade guide by taking a look at its commander and the base deck itself. Tidus Yuna's Guardian is a 3/3 human warrior that costs Bant that has the following two abilities. Firstly, at the beginning of combat on our turn, we may move a counter from target creature we control onto a second creature we control. And secondly, whenever one or more creatures we control deal combat damage to a player, we may draw a card and proliferate, limited to once each turn. Taking a closer look at our commander's strengths, Tidus is certainly bringing a lot of repeatable counter manipulation to the table, both being able to move counters from creature to creature at no mana cost, and reliably multiplying those counters via proliferate when any of our creatures are able to get in for damage, not just himself. Then coupling this with his repeatable card advantage and his relatively low CMC, we're left with a very solid source of both counter spreading and value from our command zone. That said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows for our protagonist, as for some reason WotC decided to hardcap his draw at 1 per rotation, meaning that, unlike some other Precon commanders from this set who can easily reload our entire hands with their effects, Tidus is not only hard stuck at 1 draw, but also needs something to get in for damage to be able to proc it, and seeing as he lacks built-in evasion to do this himself, he usually needs to rely on other cards to accomplish this. And while on the topic of other cards, our commander must also rely entirely on outside sources of counters, as he's unable to generate any source of initial counter himself before he can begin proliferating, positioning him firmly as a payoff/extender for counter-focused decks once the board has already been established, rather than a commander who can spread counters all on his own, meaning we'll need to make sure that any build with him at the helm has both plenty of counter generation and ways to reliably get in for damage to properly enable him. And as we take a look at the base deck, it appears that WotC at least partially is aware of this, as it contains no shortage of new and old +1/+1 counter distribution sources to load up our creatures with counters, alongside a massive amount of counter support pieces to supplement Tidus for additional value, and a serviceable number of sources of both evasion and trample to reliably get in with and proc his proliferate and draw, reasonably enabling our commander and playstyle right out of the box. But simply enabling our commander is not the same as getting the maximum usage out of him, and unfortunately, the base deck's extreme focus on +1/+1 counters results in it neglecting other types of counters that we'd rather move around with Tidus other than just stat boosting ones, with the core deck containing only 2 sources of shield counters and 1 source of flying keyword counters, resulting in us usually having to resort to just moving a single +1/+1 counter per turn, which can be useful to proliferate on a creature that doesn't have a counter already, but really isn't all that impressive. This then coupled with a large amount of summons in our creature base, which don't synergize all that well with our counter-focused game plan, seeing as they're only temporary creatures that take any counters we put on them with them when they leave, we'll see that while the deck is serviceable out of the box, there's certainly a lot of room for improvement. So, in order for us to maximize on this build's strengths while shoring up its shortcomings, we'll be dedicating most of our upgrades into improving this build's ability to generate, multiply, and spread counters outside of just +1/+1 counters, specifically by adding in more counters that can protect our creatures from removal in the form of indestructible and shield counters to make our counter-laden creatures that much more resilient, more reliable ways to multiply our counters so that Tidus can spread them to our other creatures for wider protection, and additional ways to move move counters from creature to creature, either proactively or in response to their destruction, to ensure that none of our counters go to waste. And finally, we'll be using the remainder of our budget to make some quality of life changes to our core stats for just a bit more efficiency, leaving us with a final build that will not only be able to grow its creatures to massive size with +1/+1 counters, but also make those creatures incredibly hard to interact with while also generating us massive value in the process. So let us dive into the world of Final Fantasy X, and join Tidus, a star Blitzball player whose own world was seemingly destroyed by the Leviathan Sin and now finds himself on the world of Spira, where he joins the young summoner Yuna and her guardians on their pilgrimage to obtain all the Aeons, destroy Sin to save the world, and hopefully find his way back home. Only to find that this quest is not all that it seems, discovering the dark truths of Sin, the Temple of Yevon, and even his own existence, but still willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to protect Spira, his friends, and the young summoner he fell in love with. At least until you 100% the sequel, but that's a story for another day. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and the base deck, let's see what we can do to improve it. Kicking things off with the changes we'll be making to the base deck's counter generation, which, as previously established, already has a huge number of sources of +1/+1 counters, 36 to be exact, but only 8 other sources of counters outside of those, which mostly consist of lore and stun counters that we're really not interested in moving around too much onto our own creatures. So we'll begin by cutting some of the deck's less impressive counter generators and off-theme entries in order to make space for more varied counter generation. Now, starting with the additions we'll be making to specifically make our counter-laden creatures as hard as possible to interact with, we'll be cutting the clone alter ego, who's a bit out of place here outside of its +1/+1 counter generation, so we'll be giving its spot to Techathal Inquiry Dominus, which conversely is spectacular here as both an incredibly reliable source of multiple indestructible counters, letting us repeatedly turn 3 of our spare counters into them for 1 mana and 4 life a pop, which Tidus can then move around to other targets, doubling up on all our proliferates to multiply our counters even faster, and even functioning as another evasive body to proc Tidus's proliferate and draw more reliably, as well as replacing Chasm Skulker, which is realistically more of a draw payoff than a counter payoff despite its +1/+1 counter generation, with Arwen Mortal Queen, who comes down with an indestructible counter out of the gate for only 3 mana, and if we end up proliferating that counter with no way to move it around, she can use those extras not only to temporarily make our other creatures indestructible for extra spot protection, but also distributes additional +1/+1 and lifelink counters as well when she does so to both help grow our creatures and our life totals. Then staying on the protection game plan but pivoting from indestructible counters to shield counters, since they are a bit easier to come by, we'll be exchanging out Yuna's Decision, whose self-sacrificing value and graveyard recursion modes can be useful, but we'd rather keep our creatures alive rather than sacking them or bringing them back just to have to build them up again, for Falco Spara Pactweaver, who comes down with a shield counter that we can easily proliferate and spread, gives us yet another evasive body to reliably proc Tidus, and functions as a repeatable draw source via his counter-themed Future Sight for additional value, unsummoning the Aeons Yojimbo and the Maga Sisters, both of which would find a better home in a more dedicated summon or saga-themed deck to get more repeated usage out of their effects rather than this one, to make space for Agent's Toolkit and Elspeth Resplendent, the former giving our creatures easy access to shield, keyword, and +1/+1 counters as they come down for more solid counter distribution, and even giving us the option to turn it into a cantrip once we don't need it anymore, while the latter instead takes advantage of the deck's relatively low CMC to reliably cheat out permanents with shield counters on them when we need to, or alternatively, empowering our existing creatures by making them bigger and evasive with counters, and lastly, terraforming Forge of Heroes, whose +1/+1 counter distribution to solely our commander on the turn we cast him is a bit too limited for my taste, into Diamond City, which takes advantage of our larger than average creature count to get its shield counter onto them that we can then spread to our entire board. So, having augmented this build's resilience with indestructible and shield counters, let's return our focus to the deck's +1/+1 counter generation, which, again, it has a lot of, but we'll be refining a bit by replacing some of its less impressive entries with ones that can either distribute counters more reliably or bring some extra utility to the table alongside their counter generation. As such, we'll begin by sidelining Fight Rigging, whose single +1/+1 counter per rotation is a bit weak even when considering the potential free spell it can generate, to make space for Broker's Ascendancy, whose repeatable board-wide +1/+1 counter distribution is much more impressive while occasionally growing our Elspeth's loyalty as well, swapping out Promise of Loyalty, which is not a bad board wipe but is simply outclassed by the more on-theme or simply more powerful board wipes already in the build, to swap in Rishkar Pima Renegade, whose ETB counter distribution on up to 2 creatures is okay, but we're really running for his ability to turn all our counter-laden creatures into mana dorks for an insane spike to our ramp as soon as he comes down, and a Shelving Destroy Evil, which is a bit too limited in targets to keep its spot, in favor of Requisition Raid, which provides artifact destruction, enchantment destruction, and or AoE +1/+1 counter distribution depending on what we need for more on-theme flexibility. And then to wrap up our changes on the +1/+1 counter front, we'll be cutting Summoner's Sending, which is a nice little piece of repeatable graveyard hate, but is a bit slow here where we want to be a bit more proactive in building up our creatures, as well as Yuna's Whistle, which is functionally a +1/+1 counter themed cantrip that isn't too impressive here in my opinion, since the mana value of our creature base is a bit too low to get a lot of counters off of it, in order to give their spots to District Mascot and Ingenious Prodigy, the former being both an easy source of +1/+1 counters as it comes down and when it's saddled, while also being a repeatable counter payoff that can turn its counters into instant speed artifact removal for added disruption, and the latter being a scalable body that we can either load up with a lot of counters to let us passively generate more card advantage with each passing turn, or just a few counters in order to bypass big creatures as it swings in thanks to Skulk to proc our commander if needed. And finally, as our last change to our counter generation capabilities, we'll be slotting out Together Forever, which on paper is an okay source of protection for our counter-laden creatures, but in practice simply forces us to build them back up after we cast them again, so we'll be slotting in Crystalline Giant in its place, which yes, is random, but whose 10 potential counters are mostly all usable, allowing it and eventually our board as we spread its counters around to more easily get in for damage, become deadlier in combat, and even become untargetable altogether if we get lucky, making it well worth running in my opinion. Now, having covered the majority of the new ways we'll be generating counters, let's move on to the new additions that will help us multiply and spread those counters onto our creatures alongside Tidus. Surprisingly, the base deck doesn't actually contain a lot of ways to multiply and spread counters around outside of our commander, being limited to only 5 sources of Proliferate to let us double up on our counters, and technically 5 sources of counter movement to get those counters onto other creatures if we count Sin and Yuna, who turn those counters into +1/+1 counters, which while not terribly important for the deck's +1/+1 counter distribution, since it does have a lot of individual sources of it, it does severely hamper its ability to spread keyword and shield counters. So we'll be aiming to fix that issue by beefing up both of these categories so that our creatures can better benefit from the added power and protection these counters provide, without having to rely almost entirely on Tidus to do all of the heavy lifting. Beginning on the counter-multiplying front, we'll start by letting go of both Lord Giskel Guado and Tireless Tracker, both of whose clue token generation doesn't really fit here since we have better sources of draw already, in order to make room for Thrumming Bird and Guild-Pact Informant, both of which have excellent synergy with Tidus as evasive creatures with on-damage Proliferate, exactly the same as Grateful Apparition who's already in the deck, to proc both their own and Tidus's effects every time they connect, though as a potential side grade, Guild-Pact Informant can be swapped out for Evolution Sage if we want less on-damage sources of Proliferate that we can proc on our main one, and Cutting Path of Discovery, whose ETB Explore for our creatures can be a decent source of +1/+1 counters and the occasional extra land draw, but loses out to its replacement, Izuri Stalker of Spheres, which at base augments Tidus's draw into a draw 2 via his draw on Proliferate, can be a draw 2 himself via his double ETB Proliferate if we upcast him in the late game, and only gets better as we get more sources of Proliferate into play to keep our hands nice and topped off as we multiply our counters. And then to close out our new counter multiplying additions, we'll be replacing Scholar of New Horizons, whose counter-themed land draw / ramp is just okay, the fact that it's limited to just planes and not always ramping us really holding it back, with the Mana Dork Kami of Whispered Hopes, which can tap for mana of any color for added flexibility, taps for more mana as we grow it with counters to ramp us even further, while also serving as a second copy of Hardened Scales for us to get us even more +1/+1 counters on our creatures whenever we generate them. Then pivoting from multiplying the counters already on our creatures and onto some new ways to move counters from one creature to another, we'll be replacing the Catman Kamari Valiant Guardian, who's an interesting repeatable enemy-only clone, but doesn't really do much to further our game plan apart from slowly growing himself with +1/+1 counters, with another Catman in the form of Denry Kiln, Editor-in-Chief, who instead loads up all our creatures with the same kind and number of counters he has when they ETB, making him a perfect target to move counters onto in order to drastically increase the lethality and survivability of any creatures that come into play after him. Firing Generous Patron, whose enemy counter-focus draw would be serviceable if we had more access to stun or -1/-1 counters, but since we don't, we'll give his position to Avon Courier, which lets us duplicate counters on other permanents as it swings in, making it ideal to spread high-value counters while also reliably proccing Tidus as yet another cheap evasive body, removing Pull from Tomorrow, which is admittedly an okay scalable draw source, but loses out to the more on-theme Goldberry River Daughter, who can draw us extra cards by simply spreading any high-value counters we multiply on her for the entirety of the game, and finally releasing Valifor, who suffers from all the same weaknesses as all the other summons in the base build, so we'll instead give his spot to Reluctant Role Model, which will be primarily running as another budget Ozolith, ensuring that our counters don't go to waste as our creatures die by moving them to another target, but who can also produce +1/+1 flying and lifelink counters if we can tap him down even once, the flying counter being especially valuable by allowing it and eventually all our other empowered creatures to crack in reliably. Now, having covered the numerous ways we'll be augmenting the counter aspect of our game plan, let's wrap up this upgrade with a few generic core stat improvements to help bolster its performance just a bit more. Aiming to eke out just a bit more performance from our core stat pieces, which are admittedly already pretty well balanced out of the box, we'll be using the remainder of our budget to give our ramp draw and removal suite a minor facelift to get a few extra percentage points of power. Starting with our ramp suite, we'll be swapping out Sunscorch Regent, which is way too slow for our purposes, in favor of Rampant Growth to give us one more source of staple green land ramp to both speed up and fix our mana bases at a dirt cheap cost. Then moving on to our draw suite, we'll be releasing our last Aeon, Ixion, which again will find a much better home in another build along with his other Saga creature friends, so we can bring in Kutzil Malamet Exemplar, who simultaneously takes advantage of all our +1/+1 counter distribution by letting us draw up to 3 cards per rotation as our empowered creatures get in for damage, and turns off all spellcasting for our opponents on our turn, making it significantly more difficult for our opponents to interfere with our plays. And finally, reaching our removal suite, we'll be making the rather simple change of raising Temple of the False God, which is more often than not a trap outside of a few specific mana-intensive builds, in order to put in Swords to Plowshares in its place, which gives us another piece of simple and cheap creature removal with the capability of dealing with otherwise resilient targets. So, now that we've covered all the upgrades we've made to this deck, let's take a look at the build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 33 sources of +1/+1 counters and 11 sources of other types of counters, giving us a very solid counter-focused foundation for our commander to take advantage of, 33 cards that care about counters in some capacity, including 9 sources of Proliferate and 7 ways to move counters from one creature or permanent to another, allowing us to generate plenty of value from our counter distribution, as well as supplement our commander's Proliferate and counter moving for added redundancy, 8 ways to protect our creatures from destruction or targeting, mostly in the way of shield and indestructible counters to make it as hard as possible for our opponents to remove our counter-laden creatures, and lastly, 15 sources of evasion and or trample, which is vital to reliably proc Tidus' draw and proliferate as often and as reliably as possible. For general deck stats, our final build has 12 ramp sources, 11 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, giving us a fairly typical spread of core stats with no real outliers. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 2.81, leaving us with an aggressive curve that wants to take advantage of its high cheap creature count to build the board early, load up those creatures with counters to empower and protect them, then use Tidus along with our other counter spreading and moving sources to grow our creatures' counters and or get specific types of counters onto our creatures to make them even more deadly and resilient. The total price of all the upgrades we made here then totals out to be $29.53, which doesn't include tax or shipping or the base price of the deck itself, which is an inflated $117 for the cheapest one I could find, well above its recommended $70 MSRP. So unless you already ordered it at a cheaper price, you may have to wait and see if the price drops on release to be able to buy it at a more reasonable price. Now, if we're looking to upgrade this deck even further, for an additional $5 budget increase, we can consider terraforming the Fixing Lands, Ash Barrens, and Evolving Wilds into the more counter-focused Gavany Township and Karn's Bastion, both of which better support our counter-focused game plan with the repeatable AoE +1/+1 counter distribution and proliferate they provide from our land slot, or alternatively, we can cut Crystalline Giant in favor of the more defensive Contractual Safeguard, which gives the build yet another source of shield counters for added protection, and lets us spread that counter around as well to better multiply it with our proliferation sources. Then, for a total $15 budget increase, we can do this and either replace Bread for the Hunt's damage dependent draw and Gata and Luzu's combat trick dependent counter distribution with Danny Pink and Dreamtide Whale, the former drawing us an insane amount of cards each turn by simply existing as we load up our creatures with counters, and the latter giving us up to 4 free proliferates per rotation as we and our opponents simply cast our spells for added counter multiplication, or instead we can swap out the indiscriminate board wipe Farewell and a bit to death dependent ramp piece Rampant Rejuvenator with Ripples of Potential and Herald of Secret Streams, the former not only allowing our creatures to dodge non-destruction removal and wipes that would otherwise bypass their shield and indestructible counters via its mass phase out, but also proliferates on top of that to ensure they come back even more dangerous than before, and the latter allowing all our counter-laden creatures to bypass blockers entirely by making them unblockable, easily allowing us to proc Tidus in the early game with anything for added consistency, or to alpha strike in the late game for the win. And then for a total $30 budget increase, alongside the previously mentioned changes, we can also consider either replacing the Mass Trample granting Dusk Shell Crawler with the better Mass Trample granting Kodama of the West Tree, which still grants trample to all our counter-laden creatures, and on top of that, land ramps us every time they connect to provide us with even more ramp as well, or instead swapping out Reluctant Role Models, self-counter generation and counter distribution in favor of Innkeeper's Talent, which admittedly starts off small by distributing a single +1/+1 counter per rotation, but quickly grows into a pseudo-doubling season to grow our creatures at an even faster rate, while tacking on some soft targeting protection as well as a bonus. And finally, for those of us with an unlimited budget, either due to being well off or grossly overestimating the cost of cardboard, the best of the best generic and counter support pieces will be available to be added into the build as well, where we can replace Inexorable Tide's powerful but expensive Proliferate with the much cheaper Ozolith, which will ensure that our counters never go to waste even if our opponents are able to wipe our board via moving them onto itself initially and then to other creatures at no cost, cutting Owaka Traveling Merchant for another counter-themed draw source, Polywog Prodigy, which can draw us multiple cards per rotation as our opponents cast non-creature spells, and becomes harder and harder to prevent that draw as we make it bigger and bigger. And lastly, we can remove the reasonable ramp piece, Rishkar Pima Renegade, for the abomination that is the Great Henge, this mother the Great Henge, which does require us to grow our creatures first with counters to bring down its cost, but when it does come down, provides our build with a constant stream of +1/+1 counters and card advantage as we bring down more of our cheap creatures, along with ramp and life gain on top of that, because Green has access to all the tools that it ever needs. thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Counter Blitz Precon upgrade in the books, the next Precon we'll be tackling will be the Final Fantasy XIV Scions and Spellcraft Precon, along with its face commander, Y'shtola Knights Blessed. So look forward to this upgrade and me butchering the names of half the cards in this deck coming soon. And before we go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying product through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can keep making this content. And be sure to check out all my other deck techs floating around my head or in the playlist above. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.